Okay, this PowerPoint is far too long for me to fit into the time allotted to me, so I'm actually going to skip through lots of slides and you won't be able to read them, and that will be frustrating. If you want me to email it to you, just let me know. Well, I just found that last talk so refreshing. And I think we're talking about behind the labels or beyond the labels. I like the word orthodoxy. I'm very happy with that. And all these things get attached to it. Modern orthodox, open orthodox, this type of orthodox. I get very uncomfortable. But one thing I like about this word open, when some people would describe me as open orthodox, is this idea that irrespective of what the halakha is, or what the psak is, what the ruling is in a given instance, that we're just open in the sense of open to other people, open to other ideas, open to hearing the situation that the person that is talking to us is in, open to understanding the real pain or existential angst or cognitive dissonance that the person who comes to you has, and having a loving and warm attitude, and that being the place you start from, just irrespective of what the halakha is about these unions or about these. No, I'm confronted with human beings with real emotion, real emotions in a real situation, and just being empathetic to that before you even start. But part of my issue that I'm going to share with you is when we come to the more thorny issues of, but what does the halakha actually say? I feel woefully inadequately prepared or qualified to read. I'm not a halachist. The fact that I have a smicha, it's like somebody with a certificate in first aid calling themselves a surgeon. I don't feel that I'm a halachist in any sense, and I think what I'd really like to do is to convey to you why it's so difficult to think why halakha is just so hard, right? That I think I can convey rather than what does the halakha say. And I think that if there's anything that we in the more, I know that I'm very much on the left side of orthodoxy, especially in Anglo-Orthodoxy. I'm basically a communist. But I think that there's maybe a corrective that we need to undergo, is that sometimes in the discussion amongst the very small and quiet left wing of orthodoxy, we make it sound as if the halakhic situation, the halakhic solutions are easy, right? This thing gets bandied around where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halakhic way. I don't always see that. Halakha is really, really complicated. And I think if there's anything I'm going to demonstrate to you, it's that, I think. Okay? So I want to start with two very different perspectives on a certain issue. Okay? So here we have Shlomo Riskin, who I had the great honor to study under for a while in Yeshivat HaMiftar, and Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was the preeminent posek of his generation, the preeminent halachic decisive of his generation. And there is no way that Rabbi Riskin would think that he compares as a halachist to Rav Moshe Feinstein. And there are reasons for that. Rabbi Riskin, just for a short biography, he's just done so much in the Jewish world in terms of creating institutions, building institutions, institutions for people with learning disabilities to study in Israel, institutions that help agunot and other women who need help through the rabbinic legal system in Israel to receive the help that empowers them, often from other women, championing women's learning. He is a builder and a doer, and he's created basically a town. He was basically, in a sense, the spiritual architect of Efrat, and he's a doer. One thing that happens if you're a doer is that you can't sit in the ivory tower of scholarship your whole life, whereas with Moshe Feinstein, his whole life was scholarship, and that puts him in it just puts him in a different level, and Rabbi Riskin would be the first to accept that. But what I want to do is contrast their two perspectives that I wouldn't say that I would give them equal weight in psak, that's what I'm saying, but just contrast two perspectives on the following issue. Okay. Rabbi Riskin, I'll read this out for you because there's no way most of you will be able to read it, but I think it's worth looking at. Rabbi Riskin wrote this in a now defunct journal of Yeshivat HaMiftar. So it's something that most people, I think nobody in this room would have seen. It's not available online, but I don't feel bad quoting it. It is in the public domain in that it was published, right? But you'd have to look hard to find it. I can email you the whole article, anyone who wants it. He talks about a quote from Rabbeinu Manoach about a woman leaning at the Seder table. And Rabbeinu Manoach compares the woman's exemption from leaning to her general exemptions in general. So women are exempt from time-bound positive mitzvot. Rabbeinu Manoach says the reason for that is that women have the responsibility for domestic affairs and child-rearing that make obligating them in time-bound mitzvot unfair somehow. And he says the exemption from their leaning is exactly the same because the women are responsible for cooking the Seder night meal and they're just too busy to have this obligation that every now and again they have to... I must confess that I grew up in my mother is such a capable, she's here right now, she's such a capable domestic person that was certainly the way in our Seder nights. And I remember the notion, oh yes, I must sit down and have my cup of wine. She was, and my wife complains about me that I was so acculturated to being useless around the home that I still am useless around the home. So this is the quote. It is clear from the above that both the woman's exemption from time-bound positive mitzvot, so the quote from Rabbeinu Manoach that I've not included, and her exemption from reclining at the Seder table in front of her husband are a result of her being occupied with the preparation of the meal, such that she is not available either to recline or to fulfill those positive mitzvot whose performance is limited to a certain time. But in both cases, if there are others, including her husband and children, who are involved in preparing the meal, and this responsibility does not fall exclusively upon her, she is obligated both to recline and to fulfill time-bound positive mitzvot. This opinion, therefore, does not accept the assumption that there is a qualitative difference between the woman and the man. It is clear to me that the opinion of Rabbeinu Manoach is the correct one. After all, we rule that women are permitted to fulfill positive mitzvot which are time-bound, and Ashkenazim add to this, following the Bali Tosfot, that they may even recite a bracha when doing so. So according to Ashkenazi practice, take for instance shaking the lulav on Sukkot, women are exempt from that mitzvah, but they can do it if they want to do it. And furthermore, they say they can say, according to Ashkenazi psak, they can say the bracha that says Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav, like blessed is the Lord our God who commanded us in his mitzvahs of shaking the lulav. And since women can do them if they want to, and may even recite the bracha in doing so, and furthermore, we add to another aspect. All opinions agree that a woman may declare, "I will not be fed, and I shall not do." There is I'll explain that outside. There is a contract entered into at the point of marriage, according to Orthodox halakha, where the man was basically forced into accepting all sorts of financial responsibilities for a wife and other sorts of responsibilities for a wife that the Bible doesn't force the husband into, but the rabbis did, ostensibly to protect the woman at that time. But they put so much responsibility on the man that they were worried that they had disincentivized marriage, right? It no longer looked like an attractive proposition to men. So they put into the same contract that women will take responsibility for certain things, right? But the rabbis all accepted that the woman can say at the point of marriage, I don't want to go into that agreement. I will not be fed. You don't have to pay for my food and board, husband. I have my own income. And I shall not do. I'm not going to take care of feeding you and ironing your socks. Okay? And that's allowed. And therefore, since the rabbis certainly allow that, housework is not an integral part of the marriage agreement or of the definition of the relationship between husband and wife. The situation depends to a much greater degree on the subjective agreement reached by each couple independently and on the way in which they choose to run the household. But I think this is much more radical even than it looks, Because I think if you extend this to its logical conclusion, it means that in a society or a situation in which gender roles have been massively reorganized, the whole notion of women's exemption from time-bound mitzvot goes into the air. But perhaps even more radically, the notion of men's chiyuvim to time-bound positive mitzvahs is also in the air. What happens if a man is the one raising the children at home and has the lion's share of the domestic responsibilities, and the woman's going out to work? Is he now exempt? It's very radical. And this seems to be how, I don't think Rav Riskin has ever made a psak that goes that far, but that's where his reasoning seems to be leading, right? Contrast that with this quote from Rav Moshe Feinstein's Igros Moshe. He talks about this exemption of women from time-bound positive mitzvahs. And he says, even were the conditions of life to change for women generally, and perhaps for wealthy women at all times. So the notion that it's always been the case that wealthy women didn't have to do the domestic stuff because they could always farm that off to somebody else. And there are even going to be times where women generally, because of the renegotiation of gender roles, even if it were possible to entrust the raising of children to others, as it is in our country, in America he's talking about, neither biblical law nor rabbinical law change. The metzias here, the facts of the matter, the sociology, is just not relevant. Just not relevant. And Rabbi Sachs, in an article that was put out in an Orthodox Forum book many years ago on rabbinic authority, it's a piece called Personal Autonomy. Oh no, that's not right. That was Moshe Sokol. It's called Creativity and Innovation in Halakha. He writes this in explanation of that point of Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein's point, as I understand it, is that halakha is constructed in terms of norms that obtain generally across space and time. Predictably then, there will be exemptions, there will be individuals, wealthy women, at all times, and particular societies, contemporary America at some times, to which the norms do not apply. This does not affect the law, which is predicated on that which is normal across human history and society considered as a whole, right? These kind of temporary changes are just not relevant to the halakha. The halakha is calibrated. And Rabbi Sachs, who's not endorsing this position, but trying to explain the position, puts it in the context of this quote from Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed, in which basically, I won't read the whole thing out, but basically the Rambam's position is halakha doesn't change, even though it might look like it changes. What changes is that somehow the way it gets applied to the world. And what's more, the Rambam does seem to hold that even the things in the halakha which were clearly a compromise don't change. For instance, the Rambam seems to argue, or he argues explicitly in the Guide to the Perplexed, that the sacrificial rite was a sociological compromise. In ancient Near East, it just wasn't possible to have a religion without sacrifice. It would have just made no sense to people, and it wouldn't have fulfilled their religious needs somehow. But you'd think, well, that doesn't apply any longer. That's not the case anymore. And yet the Rambam went out of his way in his Guide to Jewish law in the Mishnah Torah to rule about the sacrificial rites that none of the other Rishonim were really, or many of the other Rishonim, and none of the classic codifiers were interested in codifying because sacrifices aren't relevant anymore. They were to the Rambam, but you'd have thought if anyone thought they weren't relevant, it'd be the Rambam, because the Rambam says it was just a historical compromise. Well, maybe that's because the Rambam thinks, no, the halacha isn't supposed to change. He therefore, God, says the Rambam, cautioned against increase and diminution of the law. The verse in Deuteronomy, do not add to it or subtract from it, for constant changes would tend to disturb the whole system of law and would lead people to believe that the law is not of divine origin. But permission is... So his fear is, let's say, if you apply it to the female case, if we start to radically reconstruct the role of women in Jewish law, it will look like Jewish law is susceptible to radical change, which makes it look not divine anymore. At least that's the fear. Okay. Okay. Now, obviously, okay. Yeah, I don't really want to say what my views are on these issues, because that's not what's interesting to me at the moment is to motivate better my perplexity and confusion about all things halachic. Okay, so I think one thing we need to ask is, what is the halakha for? We need to have a good conception, a robust conception of what the halakha is for, what it's trying to do. So we have biblical law and we have rabbinic law, and there are times at which the Bible itself seems to tell us what biblical law is for, although it doesn't give us a very extensive kind of summary of the purposes of Jewish law. So I'm thinking here, for instance, you should serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep for thy good the commandments of the Lord and his statutes which I command thee this day. The idea being that somehow the commandments are commanded to us for our good. Something, and this is something that you see in the Gemara. Also, God gave us as many mitzvahs as he could. The Holy One, blessed be he, desired to give Israel merit. Therefore, he gave them much Torah and many mitzvahs. As it says, the Lord was pleased for the sake of his righteousness to make the Torah great and glorious. Had he loved us less, he'd have given us less law, which is very counterintuitive, because we think like he's made it hard enough already. No, if he loved you more, there'd be 650 commandments. But he loved you up to 613. The Rambam has actually a nice perush on this in his perush in the Mishnayos, in which he says that God doesn't expect that we're going to be able to do all the mitzvot very well. So by giving us more mitzvot, he increases our chances that we'll at least be able to do one of them well, right? Which is really nice. It's an interesting idea. I'm going to skip Soloveitchik and Rav Lichtenstein, I have to say, because we just don't have time. But again, so Rav Hirsch, I think you can see from him that if you have a robust conception of what the halacha is for, you end up with a very different conception of what the halakha is. Okay, so in his 19 letters, and then he follows up in Chorev, he talks about the following 6 categories which he thinks are exhaustive. All Jewish law, or all biblical law, fits into one of these 6. The Torah are mitzvahs to do with belief. You should believe that God exists. You should believe in the stories of the Bible in some sense or other. The mishpatim are the demands of justice, giving to each person what they are entitled to by the rights of justice. Chukim, in classical Jewish philosophy, chukim were the things that we don't really understand what their rationale is. Interestingly, Rav Hirsch says that's not the case with chukim. He says, no, chukim are the demands of justice for the inanimate and animal world. He says, you just don't always understand. When you see another human being, it's pretty easy to empathize with other human beings, and you can see what is it that justice demands for them. You just don't know much about what it is to be wool or linen. But if you did, you'd realize that there's some deep injustice in mixing them. And he puts in here animal rights and things like the justice that animals deserve certain treatment. The mitzvot, he says, are the demands to go further than mishpatim, not just to give people what they deserve, but to give people even what they don't deserve, because you're motivated by love for them. And this extends to Jews and to non-Jews. Because I'll tell you a story. I mean, this sounds like I'm bigging myself up, and I don't mean to do that. So let's pretend it's not me. Somebody I know and his wife took in for a few weeks on a sofa bed of theirs a Darfuri asylum seeker who was in prison because of some complication with his asylum application, and yada yada yada, as they say in America. a way of getting him out of prison was to have him on someone's sofa bed. So we had him on our sofa bed. And some of the frum Jews in Hendon were just like, we're just very judgmental of this. What, you've got a black guy living in your house? That's just not... I spoke earlier about the distinction between frum and religious, right? So frum has to do with kind of sociological belonging. That's just not done. Frum Jews just don't do that, right? So Rav Hirsch said, well, mitzvot are all about going much further than the demands of justice to both Jews and to non-Jews. And then he has Eidot and Avodah, which for him are all fundamentally about education. Educating both the world around us about ethical monotheism, because fundamentally Jews are supposed to be ambassadors of Judaism, of ethical monotheism to the non-Jewish world. And Avodah, internal reflection and praise towards Hashem, but it functions in educating us. It has a function in educating ourselves as well, in rededicating ourselves to our mission. So I'm not going to read these quotes because again, don't have time. But he says ultimately, all of these 6 categories can be reduced to these 3 values: justice, love, and education. But what you get out of Rav Hirsch, the demands of halakha are being a social warrior for social justice, caring greatly about ecology, right? Reading some of Rav Hirsch, he looks like he's like he was being paid by Greenpeace and PETA, and he was writing in the 1830s. It's really remarkable. And these are demands of halakha. So what I'm trying to point out to you is that's a very different conception maybe to what halakha is in Meir Sharim, right? And that comes from, I conjecture, a different conception of what the telos of halakha is. Who's right? I don't know. This appeals to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's right just because it appeals to me. Okay, how much time do I have? I'm finished, aren't I?
You have another 3 minutes.
3 minutes, great.
4.
Okay. Okay, so then you've got rabbinic law, and you've got this big. Again, you have to ask, what is it? Okay, so you've got interpretation and traditions. The rabbis interpret biblical law for us in a binding way. They have the power to make gzeirot, which is to put fences around the law, and that's authoritative. Their source of authority comes from the Bible itself, which commands us to listen to the rabbis. A good question is, well, who are the rabbis and which rabbis? I'm going to raise more. I have answers, that's part of the point. And they have the power to make takanot, which are positive or negative injunctions that aren't just about putting a fence around the law for various social needs. But I'm going to do this cool little animation thing. Let's see if it works. Did you see that? Mm-hmm. Because I want to go back to this. There's a really interesting question about whether their interpretations of the Bible are biblical or rabbinic. Right, and that's a fascinating sugya and a big machloket between the Rambam and the Ramban. I really advise people to read the new book by Moshe Halbertal on Maimonides. I think Rabbi Harris was the person who put me in its direction. I've really enjoyed reading it, and in there he talks about that debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides, and about how radical Maimonides was on that issue. Well worth a read. I'm going to skip to just one final thing I want to talk about. I'll say who this photo is and say something about what I want to say about it. This is a guy called Moshe Capel who wrote a book on the metaphysics of halakha, and he has a really nice sketch of how the halakha evolves over time. You've got the intuitive interpretation of the prophets, prophetic interpretation, and then you've got the formalization of the rabbis. Take, for instance, that famous Gemara where Moshe Rabbeinu sees Rabbi Akiva teaching, and he doesn't understand what Rabbi Akiva is saying, and then Rabbi Akiva says, "I got this from Moshe," and Moshe's like, huh? Right? And Moshe Capel's kind of gloss on that is, we all speak English, and we normally speak it within limits, but we normally speak it basically grammatically, right? But who of us could formalize all of the rules of grammar in English? And who of us would recognize them? But we're all abiding by them already, right? And what Moshe Capel says is, well, the rabbis come along and they formalize stuff that was somehow intuitive beforehand. So Moshe didn't recognize it, just like you as an English speaker might not recognize a systematic syntax for English. That doesn't mean you're not abiding by it already, and it doesn't mean that the grammarian, when he provides a formal account of grammar, he is paying attention to what you as English speakers do, or he or she is, and then applies a formalization. But then the formalization becomes part of the halakha. The judges then make decisions, but then again, the process keeps going on because the decisions of the judges are often just very intuitive, like the prophets were initially. And then later commentators will comment on earlier judgments, and there's a reformalization as things go on. Okay, but the thing I wanted to end with, I don't have time for this, is some of this paper by Rabbi Sachs. People, am I being recorded? I'm being recorded. Okay. Okay, so I think it's well known for people who know me that Rabbi Sachs is something of an idol to me, and idolatry is bad. So it's good that there's something that I don't agree with him on completely. So that's good, because I don't want to be guilty of idolatry. One criticism people have of Rabbi Sachs, and it's something that's heard a lot, is, he kowtowed to his bet din on this issue, on that issue, on that issue. Actually, I think that this article, written in the 90s, early 90s, before he was chief rabbi, like I said, it's called Creativity and Innovation in Halakha, shows you that that's probably not a fair criticism of Rabbi Sachs at all. People don't realise that there is a conservative, with a small c, conservative streak in his thought. He's very, very liberal on some issues in terms of his being open. He'll talk about anything, he'll read anything, he's willing to engage, he's empathetic and sympathetic, but there's a deep strain of conservatism in his halachic thought. And the compulsion people had to say, he kowtowed to his beit din, was because those people want to think that Rabbi Sachs agrees with them, and they don't agree with the beit din, so they said, obviously Rabbi Sachs agrees with me, but he just kowtowed to his beit din. That's unfair to Rabbi Sachs. It's just unfair to him. He can disagree with you, and that's okay, right? And you can disagree with him. That's okay too. In this article, he talks about some of the really radical things in halakha that give us the sorts of scope to be really innovative and evolutionary. And he kind of pours like a skeptical gloss over them all. So, lo bashamayim hi. You hear people throw this out. Lo bashamayim hi is this idea that even if God comes down and tells you himself, like through a bat kol, that the halacha is X, if the rabbis say Y, the majority of the rabbis say Y, then the halacha follows the majority of the rabbis. And people take this, especially on the left of the spectrum, to say, well, this shows you autonomy, right? We can all, it's all up to us, it's all up to... Says Rabbi Sachs, no, this is a very Catholic rather than a Protestant principle. What he means by that is you have to follow the majority of your peers even when they're wrong, right? The notion of Catholicism as opposed to Protestantism, Catholicism has this church. Protestantism was all about personal autonomy. Like, let the individual rabbi teach the halakha as he sees it. No, says Lo Bashamayim Hi. Follow the church. Right? It's a very Catholic principle, says Rabbi Sachs. It's not the kind of free pass to liberalism that people might think it is. Ein lo l'dayan masha eino ra'ot is a principle often used, which is that a judge, when he judges a case of halakha, he is obliged to judge things as he sees them. Right, which seems like there's a huge amount of kind of autonomy there to the judge. But Rabbi Sachs talks about the fact that no, it's not. It doesn't have as wide a scope as people think. There's in halakha, there's the notion of a davar mishnah, something which has been received. That's not up to change. There are other places where there's a shikul hadat, where you can, or there are sometimes where the reason for halakha was just a svara. If it was just a svara, then your svara, a svara is like an idea, your svara might be just as good, and therefore you might have the authority, but other times you don't have the authority. Again, not necessarily a free pass, you just need to know more before you can use these sorts of principles. It's not as the halakhic game isn't as easy as you think it might be, because for every good argument you've got, there's about 1 trillion arguments against you, and you just need to know more. I need to know more. Horat sha'ah, people talk about this notion of when the halakhic system is under pressure, and there are external things that are going on, and you're under pressure, you make a horat sha'ah, some sort of compromise with the moment. Rabbi Sachs shows in a really interesting way how it's so interesting what normally motivates a horat sha'ah. And it's not normally the big meta values of Judaism, like there are meta values in Judaism, like don't embarrass those without means, benefit repentant sinners, the Torah cares for the possessions of Israel. There's all sorts of principles that the rabbis will often wheel out in order to kind of push in a certain direction. No, normally horat sha'ah is just motivated by the need to protect the halakhic edifice. We're worried there's going to be some sort of collapse, wholesale collapse of the halakha. In those cases, that's the sort of cases in which the posek will relate to horat sha'ah. This really is the last slide, and almost finished. Rabbi Sachs has he talks about these two things which seem to conflict with one another. One sense in which halakha is a protest against history, and yet another sense in which halakha is deeply historical. So the protest against history is the idea that we live as halakhic Jews in a constant present. We communing with the Rambam as if he's still alive, Rashi as if he's still alive, they're all conversing around us, right? We're just ahistorical. And we left Egypt, and we went to Israel, and we remember these things. We're living in a kind of ahistorical, and yet halakhic chiddush, at least of the type he's talking, has a deep respect for history. Just to say, if something has always been done a certain way, you can't, without a great kind of weight of halakhic argument, just say, we're going to do it differently now. And what's interesting is Rabbi Sachs, he's warning you against taking values from outside of the halakha. He talks about, and with this I'll finish, he talks about different ways of finding halakhic arguments for greater participation of the example we've been using so far is women in the halakhic world. One sort of argument, and he accuses certain conservative responsa of this, and he quotes them at length, is to say, well, some of the halakhic values, like kavod hatzibur, are just meaningless today. Another argument would be to say, no, they're still meaningful today, but their application is different, right? And those are remarkably different methodologies, maybe for arriving at the same conclusion. But the point is that if you come and say, well, I have this value of egalitarianism from outside Judaism, and these values inside Judaism are just no longer... That he even quotes halakhic conservative poskim as saying, well, on this particular issue, the rabbis were just wrong. Their value system was just wrong, and we've seen now, we've been educated that their value system was just wrong. That would be deeply problematic. Yet you might be able to find solutions to the very same problems in exactly what Rabbi Lopatin did in his first talk, and showing how the Aruch HaShulchan was able to find a huge leniency in the laws of Eruvin, not by ditching halakhic principles, but by understanding their application to the world in a very different way to how it had previously been understood. Okay, so all I've been trying to do is say, gosh, isn't this stuff really complicated? What's the virtue of doing that? Well, I suppose I'm acting as a corrective, because I'm speaking to a group of people who I hope, sincerely, are deeply motivated by this agenda that's often called the open agenda of bringing people in, of being respectful of homosexual couples and people who've married out, and being respectful of the situation people are in, understanding the value of greater and more meaningful participation for women in the Jewish. We have those values, and those values are really important. That I sign on, I'm behind them. But what we shouldn't do is think that the task is really simple. Let's just rewrite the halakha now. No, the task is really hard, and we have an obligation. If we want to succeed, we have an obligation to do two things. One is to either learn as much as we can ourselves, or to foster an environment in which we empower other people to learn a great deal, men and women and everybody. And the second thing we have to do is to be resolute in our Yirat Hashem and in our Avodat Hashem, and make sure that this whole endeavor is saturated with the religious principles that motivate it. Otherwise, I think we will become a laughingstock, and that's our responsibility. My rabbi is married to a woman who is also basically my rabbi, called Batya Hefter, who is a phenomenal educator and just a tremendous Talmidah Chachma. And she hated it when my wife spoke about empowerment. I hate that word, empowerment. She said, it's not about you. It's not about you. How much access do you get to shul? It's about Hashem. It's about your avodah. Is the current status quo allowing you to fulfill your potential as an Avedet Hashem? It's not about your empowerment, it's about your service of Hashem. And I think that if our community keeps exactly the values that it has, but infuses it with a deep learning and a deep religiosity, a desire to serve our Maker collectively and better, we will be stronger for it.
We're short on time, so let's take a few questions. Yeah? Yes?
Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk in many senses. I'd like to see the other slides, actually. You did mention a concept of the Eilu Ve'elu Divrei Elokim Chaim, which is so relevant when you're looking at this whole... Sorry, Eilu Ve'elu Divrei Elokim Chaim, which is so relevant when you're looking at this whole question of interpretation of halakha.
Yeah.
Because if you have a rigidity in halakha, which might be, if you like, there are things that no rabbis would agree are allowable in halakha. You can't eat chazah, right? So that's clearly outside. There may be a grey area of boundaries within, but there are very strong arguments within halakha between very great rabbis, and neither would necessarily accuse the other of being wrong. Hillel and Shammai did not accuse the other of being wrong. And therefore, once you allow for the concept of Eilu Ve'elu, then you can say, what is the frame of reference in my circumstances, or our circumstances, in a particular time, in a particular place, the frame of reference under which we would interpret halakha. So, for example, you don't like the words modern orthodox. Rabbi Sachs certainly doesn't like the words modern orthodox, but I think it's a great word because modern seems to enshrine modern values such as democracy, equality of opportunity, freedom of speech. These are modern values for which over hundreds of years people have fought and died. And it gives you a frame of reference into which halakha can be interpreted. So, for example, on women's roles, you would start that men and women are equal, but if there is a halakhic objection to it, to certain aspects of it, then okay, you've come up against that hard wall of halakha, but it's by exception, it's not your starting point. And of course, another group of Jews, even at the same time, we know that the Haredi world would start from completely opposite. Okay, if it's demanded, absolute demand, you force it out of us, then we will say that women can have certain rights, but only because you forced it out. So it's not by exception. So I think this concept of Eilu Ve'elu within a very rigid boundary, almost the rigid boundary of Moshe Feinstein, would explain a lot of the ways we could look at halakha.
So I want to respond to, thank you very much for the comment. It's an interesting, insightful and provocative comment. But there are two things I'd like to respond with. The first is, I think Eilu Ve'elu Divrei Elokim Chaim is a great example of what I'm trying to say, that it sounds like a simple fix-all, but it's really, really complicated what its application is and its scope is, right? So, yes, we have this principle about Hillel and Shammai, that they were both the words of the living God, and they seem to get on very well despite their disagreements, but we see in the rabbinic tradition really, really forceful debate sometimes where they say, no, you are just wrong. I mean, the Aruch HaShulchan, for instance, talks about the Ramah buying land in Israel on Shabbat, a certain sugya, he says it's a mitzvah to, if you own a Shulchan Aruch, to delete this phrase of the Ramah from because it's just so offensive, you should delete it. And he knew about the principle of Eilu Divrei Elokim Chaim. Why wasn't he able to say, I think Tzarech Ian Godel, we really need to try, there's a fantastic book by Avi Sagi on Eilu Divrei Elokim Chaim, where he tries to marshal all of the source material about what that principle is before we can be qualified to apply it. And finally, about this notion of modern orthodoxy, I'm more comfortable with it than Rabbi Sachs is, but I understand some of the discomfort, which is, no, my values do not come from outside of the Torah. Hashem gave me the Torah came to us at Har Sinai, and it has all the values we need in it. And if democracy is a value, then it's there in the Torah. It might be, and I'm completely open to the idea, that democratic history has helped to open our eyes to something that was in the Torah. But to say that modern qualifies orthodoxy because we're taking values from outside to qualify our orthodoxy, I think that's potentially dangerous. And yet, I'm committed to the notion that even if everything is in the Torah, some of the things in the Torah are harder to find there, and modernity has been something that has opened our eyes to certain latent values. I think that the rights of women that were trodden over for so long, I mean, take for instance women in Jewish learning, the doors that have been closed to women scholars over the generations of Judaism is just a busha to us. But there was absolutely no grounds from the beginning till today for that. And all that modernity has made clear to us is, gosh, yes, this value really is there in the Torah, and how bad, what a tragedy that we have fallen so short historically.
I think because we don't want to be late for the next panel, we have a little bit of a break now. I just want to thank, on behalf of everyone, Rabbi Lebens, for challenging us, really, because some of the things you said are quite challenging, and for at least opening up the difficulties that you experience, and that it's not to gloss over it. So thank you for that. Thank you.